And here we have Dr. Luis Fernando Angosto Ferrandez, and he's going to talk about political symbols in times of social instability, learning from the uses and functions of national flags. And I think he's not going to use any aid, so everything is working. He's just going to go the classical way, which is going to be very inspiring. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I hope so. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Angel Lopez and colleagues from SRAP organizing the event, and thanks to the sponsors. I see a few smiles in the audience, perhaps thinking that we'll see what happens without any visual support and the old style. And actually, I'm going to go full on old style in the sense that my goal is to really share ideas that are partly in the making. I would like them actually really ready very soon, but I'm still working on them. But I'll let you know about my current project and what I think is the intriguing aspect of the project I'm developing and I'm working on with other colleagues. So specifically, I've been working on the question of political symbols for a while. I'm a social anthropologist and have a comparative interest. I've undertaken many years of fieldwork in Venezuela. I've worked in Spain as well. And I've lived elsewhere as well in other countries. As you know, I'm now here in Australia, but I've lived as well in Ireland and so forth. So I've got, over the years, I've gained a bit of an insight of how people used symbols, among them national flags, differently in different parts of the world, but as well with some common features. And I'm going to be speaking of what I'm trying to answer at the moment, and it's this question of why we, once and again, this is recurrent, and it is very, very well documented across different cultural spheres, why people resort to the usage of political symbols, and particularly to symbols such as national flags, with more intensity, precisely in periods of instability. Now, for you, to give you a little bit of a more intriguing presentation, I'll explain how I abstract from this to show what my research question is. But I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. And as you know, hopefully, and fingers crossed, we are coming out of the pandemic, hopefully at least some of us unscathed, but in general, we are looking forward to come out of this pandemic. What we have seen in this pandemic is yet again a good number of examples of this phenomenon. The pandemic has generated what I denominate social instability, and it's basically the accentuation of some pre-existing social tensions in some countries and the generation of other tensions in some others. And amidst this scenario, some people have gone onto the streets to protest and with demonstrations of different political inclination, but we have seen political symbols figuring prominently. Among them, national flags, even in countries in which authorities prevent people to bring them onto the streets. So this phenomenon is what I'm trying to answer. So the question is, why does this happen? Well, some people naturalize this. They do not want to speak about it. They find political symbols too polarizing or emotionally confronting, or for emotional or reasonable reasons confronting. And some other people do not consider this significant for social analysis and for political analysis. I think it's very significant because, again, it is what you may denominate a recurrent anthropological phenomenon. And why is this to me very intriguing? Because let me explain what we know about symbols from the social sciences. Actually, and against common wisdom, we do not know what national symbols mean. Actually, there is this concept that social analysts used to speak about symbols, and is that they are multivocal, that they are actually opaque. So when you see a symbol, you see a flag, you see certainly the outward form, and that is identifiable, but no one really knows what this means. That's what the concept of multivocality goes to speak about. So people speak about the fact that it is opaque. What we actually, when we see people just waving flags, they're waving an opaque object that projects and harbors a multiplicity of themes and significations. So then how intriguing this is that in our species, we like to look at ourselves in the mirror, and maybe if we're not looking good, at least we look rational. Well, maybe in addition to rational, we are something else, you know. And it is very intriguing that in our species, again, once and again, what we find is that the more uncertainty we find in our political scenario, the more uncertainty and instability we find in our social scenario, the more we resort to a form of communication that is precisely characterized by the lack of precision, by ambiguity. So is that the case? Well, perhaps, or perhaps is that we are doing something else in addition to somehow resorting to non-verbal registers of communication. In this scenario, we displace, if you want, the precision of verbal language, and we resort to non-verbal registers of communication. What we are meaning is something else. So that's what I'm trying to explain. And actually, this is a very old question in the social sciences, but actually, my whole point is that it has not been answered convincingly. And I try to explain this through the work of a variety of authors. I mean, I'll be speaking about two of them, and I'll wrap up with an argument. One of them, who identified this same issue and addressed it through her own style and her own way, is Catherine Verdery. She wrote a fantastic book in which she speaks about the political life of dead bodies. And Catherine Verdery basically worked for very many decades, actually, in Eastern Europe, and at some stage she was struck by what she identified as what she denominated literally the sheer number of episodes in which people were digging bodies and reburying them, corpses, and as well she treated statues as dead bodies. She says, well, what's an statue after all? It's like a dead body, or a dead body cast in bronze or in iron. So she basically found that in post-socialist scenarios, in these countries that after the collapse of the Soviet Union were going to through a transition, there was a sheer amount of examples of not only intensified activity around these symbols, but also displacements, digging out, digging in, and so forth. And she went to provide a hypothesis. She said that this has something to do with the stabilization of political orders. She presented that hypothesis, but basically she never answered it, because the perspective that she represents in the social sciences is an anthropologist who considers that social scientists should not be concerned with the search for causalities, and instead we should be concerned with the identification of the meanings that social activity produces. If you are familiar with the question, is what separates a Weberian approach to social sciences from others. So she never really provided an answer, documented very well what she denominated the universes of signification of this process, and demonstrated how in these scenarios, people were very keen to project particular meanings of national building and reconstitution and so forth through the manipulation of corpses. Now, she didn't answer the question. Then I ended up looking at someone who, on the contrary, was so keen to search for causalities, a little bit perhaps too much. And it's one of the founding figures of sociological thinking and anthropological thinking, Durkheim. And he actually provided an argument about this, incidentally and very significantly, in my view, in his work on religion. And this is an author who you may be familiar with, and who had he was very committed to theorize society as a sort of binding force, a sort of unifying force, and a real force that was out there, but was binding us. Nevertheless, he spent his whole life speaking about crisis, and basically how this binding force is very, very frequently in crisis, and worked out this concept that he used throughout his career of collective effervescence. Gave different connotations to the concept, but at some stage, left aside the idea that collective effervescence was something negative or pathological and dangerous, and found that there were integrative elements in these episodes of effervescence. In periods, he said that people at some stage feel preoccupations, and this leads to intensified social activity, intensified social relations, and intensified or more numerous episodes of congregation. And in episodes of congregation, a sort of electricity is produced that can lead to heroic acts or to barbarism, but at the same time is a space in which people feel the necessity to crystallize their collective identity and sentiments through material symbols, objects. He went to theorize the function of the totem along these lines, and more so, he went to say that national flags are the modern totem. So he connected national flags to this. So the argument actually makes a little bit of sense if you think that what people do in these scenarios of crisis then is to actually search for their constitution of community and for the crystallization of a sensation of community. But if you actually look at the ethnographic record, and I've worked in different places with this, what you find is that the picture is more complicated because the usage of flags tends to be rather factional, rather than an appeal to a community. Very often we see a demonstration of factionalism. So that's what the ethnographic record complicates. And then all of a sudden, Durkheim didn't help us now, and I'll just try to wrap up and give you a bit of a spoiler of what my argument ends up. And it's not very comforting, but I think, of course, it's indispensable to understand what type of being we are, human beings. And then basically I kept on reading and searching, and what you find is that some people said, well, after all, what national flags really demonstrate is that they do not really represent society. They are more about, they represent the power that controls society. And this is the expression that literally another anthropologist used in a criticism of Durkheimian work, and he's Raymond Firth. He didn't develop his argument much, but I really just got a little bit of his take and I wanted to develop it. So flags represent the power that controls society. Then I said, so what can you do with this? And then what are people doing when they go waving flags? And then I ended up just revising the work of another anthropologist who said, what happens when we do not understand symbols? And this is an anthropologist, actually he worked in Australia for a while, Roger Kissing, who did a lot of ethnography in Solomon Islands, and he was studying religious rituals, and what he found is that against common wisdom, when people participate in rituals, they do not share meanings. They actually just very often not only perceive, but also project different meanings. And he said, so then how do we explain what happens here? What do people do when they participate in rituals if they do not really demonstrate that a shared meaning is happening? He went to say that what happens is that people demonstrate a cultural competence that includes the recognition of hierarchies of authority. That is, and he went to say, the analysis of ritual demonstrates that they can be reproduced without necessarily people sharing meanings. How can we find demonstration? He says, well, you find that there are ritual authorities. People who work on the renewal and the reproduction of the ritual are experts. So there is an even distribution of knowledge that actually marks a hierarchy. And people, incidentally, some of the people who hold this knowledge hold what we denominate political power. So people, when they participate in rituals, they do not necessarily share meanings, but they share an understanding of hierarchies of powers in their society. So out of this is where I developed my argument. And of course, I was trying to summarize this in a talk of 1 hour 2 weeks ago, and it didn't work. So let me just give you a very full-on spoiler and see if you can make sense of it. What people do here are two things. On the one hand, because I think you need to distinguish different types of activities. But when people bring this type of political symbols onto the street, they are not only recognizing a structure of power, but demanding the intervention of social authorities into social process. May seem simple, but maybe it's not so much if you read what other people say about these things. But at the same time, it's a process of selection of leaders. Because what we find once and again after this period of instability is political rituals in which authorities, be they the pre-existing ones or the newly emerging ones out of the crisis, somehow settle the circumstance and provide stability with the direct manipulation of symbols. So that's it.
Actually, I have to apologize because I actually didn't introduce your affiliation, and you and I are colleagues at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Sydney Uni. So double apology here for a colleague. He's in the Latin American Department of Spanish and Latin American Studies.
That's right, an anthropology.
Yes, an anthropology. Okay, thank you. Do we have questions? One question online?
Yes.
Or
okay, Michael Hromek is asking, he says, I like the idea of symbols that appeal to community. Do you have any examples or opinions on effective symbols?
Well, many, but I see that my attempt didn't work so well, because what I was saying is that they are not so much representing community, unfortunately, but they represent more the power that controls community. It's a little bit different because basically when we see how flags are used in the real life, and of course, many of you are familiar with the scenario in Spain, you find that it's been taking on a meaning of factionalism that certainly is not really shared by all members of the community. So yes, I mean, the case of Spain is singular, but only to some extent of this phenomenon. There is actually as much, if you want, potential conflict as unity in the usage of political symbols, and national flags in particular.
Thank you.
I think Luis has
Yes,
another question.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. And I have a question from the point of view of social psychology and sociology, the work of Lakoff and others. What would you get from there is that these are symbols of identity. And you mention it and you frame it as an issue of power. But if it's really an issue of identity, what you get is the more you ascribe to a social identity, the more you lose your individual freedom. So the connection with the power is that this assumption of identity could be an elective assumption. So you are not forced to take this identity, you just unconsciously take the identity and you lose your freedom.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm actually familiar, I'm very interested in what social psychology has to say about this, but again, I find it relatively non-satisfactory, among other things, because I think there is a little bit of a danger in this presentation of participation in protest and these collective identifications as semi-pathological, because you may end up pathologizing certain political claims, and that's it's a classical presence in the work of Durkheim and other 19th century social psychologists or social analysts who pathologized protest and so forth, precisely along these arguments, the idea that there is a primitivist behavior in this type of a scenario. So to some extent, I just take that with a pinch of salt. But the other point has to do with the fact that I try to explain why I think it's important to recast part of this process is what I want to try to explain. I think there is something key in trying to understand this phenomenon by looking at the fact that this is precisely more intense and more prominent and more frequent in periods of social instability. So what do people look for in periods of social instability? That's what is, to me, the key to try to find an answer. So I'm not speaking of banal nationalism and national flags in other contexts. It's these periods of social instability, which I try to define conceptually as well. So thanks very much. Anyway.
Thank you. One just last brief question.
Yeah, a quick question. Thank you for your presentation, very timely. I just have a question about profanation. How does profanation as an act operate within your argument in relation to rituals, in relation to symbols?
Yeah, well, to me it's as well, I think actually fits with my argumentation, because profanation, precisely what we find is that is heavily sanctioned. Basically, the power that controls society, you can look at legislation or what governors say about what can happen to you if you profanate a national symbol. You may end up in jail or even in more deeper places. So it's actually, to me, that shows that we need to take this seriously. Political elites have forever been very interested in saying who has the right to control, particularly the public manipulation of these symbols. So what the profanation, or basically, if you want, the subversion in the usage of these symbols, what demonstrates that in some cases people, and particularly when this becomes a mass movement, I think we need to take it seriously. People are very, very dissatisfied with social authority, to speak of an abstracted term of real social power and the authorities that represent it. So that's my approach to that. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
Thank you.